Hey everybody, so this is the second lecture in the U.S. government course that I'm offering for us to discuss different issues. And the last time we went through and we talked about politics, we talked about government, we talked about democracy, and we talked about dictatorships. And it's interesting that I attended an event this last weekend where someone goes, "We don't have a democracy or a republic." I said, it's a democracy, it's a representative democracy. I don't know why that's hard for people to understand, but anyway, maybe it's just a pet peeve of mine and maybe I need to adjust. So today we're going to talk about really some of the origins of government and really what government should do. And in this class, one of the things we're going to keep asking is a basic question of epistemology, which is, how do we know what we know? When you make a decision or you state something, you always have to ask yourself, okay, well, how do I know this? Was it because I read it on social media? Did somebody tell me this? Was I raised this way? How do I know this? And that's an important question because some of the things that we think we know, we really don't know. And I get criticized this for sometimes because I'll say there's no such thing as common sense. Because common sense here, say in Canada or Fort Worth, wouldn't necessarily be common sense in New York, right? They could probably set me down in New York and they go, well, it's just common sense you do this. And I'd be going, I don't know. Or common sense in Japan, or common sense in Europe. You just don't know. So when we think about what we know and how do we know it is an important question for us always to ask. And more so now as we begin this discussion. And we want to talk about first the origins of government. And I'm not going to go through everybody. I'm just going to touch on some of the major ones here and some of the major theories. This is supposed to be sort of a survey class. I don't go into detail as much as you might think, but you can always read more about it. So let's talk about the origins of government. And we can go back to Thomas Hobbes, British philosopher. And Hobbes wrote a book called Leviathan, and in it he describes his origins of government. Hobbes said that man was born in a state of nature in which there was no government. And that led us to this anarchy. It was everybody against everybody. And the famous quote from Hobbes is that life was poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So life sucked. So to simplify this up, Hobbes said that, look, what we did was we entered into a contract with a king or a strong man. And this was the terms of this sort of social contract. Terms were that this king would protect us from invasion so that we wouldn't get attacked by neighboring tribes. And the king would keep order to make sure that, our neighbors didn't steal from us or come over and abuse us. In return, we gave the king all of our rights, including the right to revolt. So in other words, that if you had a terrible king, Hobbes would say, well, too bad. You just got to wait till that king dies. So when you look at Hobbes, his view of society is a very grim one. And so when somebody tells you, hey, you have sort of a Hobbesian view of the world, that means you really have sort of a grim view of the world. Now, about 100 years later, another man comes along by the name of John Locke. And John Locke's influenced by the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in Great Britain, writes his 2 treatises on government. And Locke says, and Locke had read Hobbes, and he said, yes, Hobbes is right about a few things. Hobbes is right that man was born in a state of nature. That's true. And there was no government. And that people entered into a contract with somebody to protect them from invasion and to keep order. But Locke, and there are others too, John Stuart Mill and others, but Locke says, look, the king had one other job, and that was to protect your natural rights. Now, natural rights, and because Locke says that everybody is endowed with certain natural rights. Now, Locke says it's life, liberty, and property. And that this government was created to protect those natural rights. And that these rights were inalienable. because they were given to you by God. And so Locke would argue that if the government that you had was violating your rights, not only did you have the right to change that government, overthrow it, or institute some sort of changes, but it was really your duty as citizens to change that government. So what Locke is really coming up here with is what we would call government by consent, and rejecting the idea of divine right rule. And Locke is going to be very influential on the Declaration of Independence, because, if I were to tell you that all men are endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and you say the pursuit of happiness instead of property, that government is created by men to make sure these rights are secure, and then these rights cannot be taken away because they're endowed to you by your creator, and that when government fails to do that job of protecting your rights, you have the right to overthrow it. That's the Declaration of Independence written by Jefferson. It's pure John Locke. Now, he doesn't footnote, there's no bibliography page, but he's not plagiarizing, because the idea behind that is that when Jefferson writes that, he knows that when people read it, they know who he's referring to. And so they're good with that. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about some of the other more antiquated theories, if you will, that we've seen in the past. One of them is what we call the divine right theory. Now, the divine right theory said that God had chosen certain people to rule over their fellow men, kings, queens, people named Brian, ignore that part, and that these people had a hotline to God. These were God's direct representatives on earth. And so their power would be absolute, because if you were to go to the king and say, hey, I disagree, the king would say, I've just talked to God, you're wrong. You couldn't disagree at that point, because then you're a blasphemer. And you had divine right kings in Europe, and even enlightened ones like Charlemagne, who chopped off 5,000 heads. So that divine right of kings, sort of a European thing, it's going to be refuted by John Locke. Another theory is what we call the force theory. This isn't a Yoda thing. There's an idea out there that maybe government began because you had somebody bigger or stronger than you or in the group, and they enforce their will on everybody else, right? Sort of like a pride of lions, right? The alpha dog, that concept. Another theory of this is what we call the patriarchal or matriarchal theory. And this suggests that government really grew up out of the extended family, right? That you had at the top, you had the head of the family, and he ruled through his sons in a patriarchy, which just means men ruling, and they would rule through their sons. It's a very tribal system. And so if you were to go to, say, Africa today, you might find somebody, if you were in Nigeria and say, what are you? They may not immediately say Nigerian, they may say they're Igbo, right? Based on a family affiliation. This will cause severe problems during the scramble for Africa when colonial powers don't understand this type of government, and they start dividing up these lands without any regard to tribal authority, these traditional governmental structures. Now, I said a patriarchy is ruled by men, a matriarchy is ruled by women. We haven't had a really functioning matriarchy yet, except that Themyscira, home to Wonder Woman. But we're probably heading that way as we see more women than men in college and more women getting elected. So we may see a change in terms of the domination of the political players. Another theory is what we will call the Marxist theory, named after Karl Marx. Now, Marx believed, and I'm simplifying here, and I'll bring somebody on to talk a little bit more about Marx. Marx believed that government was created by the rich for the sole purpose of maintaining their richness and preventing other people from getting ahead. That was the idea. And they believe, Marxists would believe in a modern communist system, which you haven't seen, is that ability teachers need, that it would be share and share alike, and people work in harmony. Now, normally when I ask my students, what do you think about that? They'll say, well, no, that would never work. And I'll ask why, and they'll tell me that people are naturally greedy. And that goes back to epistemology. How do you know that? What makes you think that people are naturally greedy? So think about that one for a moment, because we know that we've done a DNA study and there's no greed gene. right? You're still thinking about how is that possible? Well, you need to remember where you were born, right? You were born in in the United States, which is primarily a capitalist nation where they teach you that greed is good. So a lot of it is just from your personal luck of the draw of where you were born, right? You might identify yourself as a Christian, but if you were born in Saudi Arabia, that's probably not going to be the case, right? And so you need to think outside of that proverbial box, I'm sorry for that cliche, about what people are. We still have communities in the world that don't base their success on material wealth. And the idea of capitalism itself is only about 700 years old, that people fought for other things and sought honor and other ideas rather than material wealth. So it's a new thing. But the Marxists would say that it should be share and share alike, and that government's only created to keep poor people down. Now, the last theory that I really want to mention is the one I sort of like the best, and that's the historical theory. The historical theory thinks it's a little bit of all of these elements, whether that's the family with the patriarchy, matriarchy, whether that's economics with Marx, whether it's sort of a military style with the force theory, was it religion that played a part, that each one of these little components together created what we have government today and is still augmenting what we do with government. All right, so those are some different theories on the origins of government. There's a lot more, but we're just touching base here. So let's talk about what should government do, right? That's a tough question. Well, we'll start off with the anarchists. Now, the anarchists believe really in no government. They believe that any type of rule or regulation inhibits your personal freedom. And you think about it, that is true, right? If you join a club has rules, right? If you join a football team, it has rules. So organizations, by their very natures, have rules. And of course, the biggest organization you can think of is government, right? And so they see government as a way of inhibiting your personal liberty. Now, the anarchists had their heyday really in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Anarchists were believed to be behind the Haymarket Square riot. Anarchists killed the Spanish prime minister at the time. Anarchists killed half the Russian royal family. Anarchists assassinated President William McKinley. But for anarchists, it's really tough to have a huge movement because part of the problem is it means that you have to organize. Now, next up are the libertarians. And there's a libertarian party in the United States. And the libertarians believe in the ultimate in personal responsibility and personal freedom. And libertarians would suggest that government really only has two functions, and that's to keep order, so there'd be some sort of police force, and then to protect us from invasion. And they would withdraw troops from all over the world, really, to protect U.S. borders. So we wouldn't be invaded from Mexico, or more importantly, Canada, because, you know, Canada's already up to it. I mean, think about the Canadian spies. Celine Dion, Canadian spy. Michael J. Fox, Canadian spy. Jim Carrey, Canadian spy. Justin Bieber, obnoxious Canadian spy. And NHL Stanley Cup that travels around the United States, Canadian listening device. Oh, you think I'm crazy. You think I'm crazy. But you wait. One day you're going to wake up holding a Molson beer and wearing a toque, and you're going to go, what's this about? And then it's all too late. We're Canadians. Now, the libertarians would say, look, you want a school? Let you get together with your friends and build a school. Some libertarians would argue that if you want to snort cocaine and walk down the street carrying an AK-47, that's okay, as long as you don't hurt anybody. Or that if you buy a brand new car and you go to hit the brakes and they don't stop, then and it crashes, that's your fault. It's not the government's job to make sure that cars are safe or drugs are safe. They argue that companies would not sell you an unsafe product because it would put them out of business. I'm not so sure if I necessarily believe that, but they do. Many libertarians, because the libertarians run candidates for office all the time, actually moved out of their party and moved into more of the Republican Party. Ron Paul and his who ran for president, his son Rand Paul, and I think they've really, especially in Texas, I would argue that maybe have morphed into they're Republicans, but they're libertarian evangelicals, which is an interesting concept. Now, the next two terms I don't like because Lord knows people throw them out there fairly clueless of what they mean because these terms change all the time. And that's conservatives and liberals. And I'm going to give you a couple of definitions of each. And if you don't like them, you can go find some other definitions because those definitions change all the time. But this is going to be a sort of a general philosophical look at conservative and liberal. And it's theoretical. Don't get conservative and liberal mixed up with Democrat and Republican, okay? So a conservative, for example, in theory, believes that the government should stay out of your private life and stay out of your economic life. Now, obviously, we can find policies where conservatives or Republicans who claim to be conservatives are hypocritical on this issue. Whereas liberals believe that government should stay out of your private life, but be involved in your economic life to regulate and protect you. And of course, we can find Democrats who claim to be liberal that are also hypocritical on some of these issues as well. Now, what brought that concept apart primarily was in the 1800s when you saw the rise of huge corporations. And there are those political players, presidents and senators, who said, something has to stop these huge corporations. They're so powerful. And the only entity big enough to do that, they would argue, was government. And that's what they mean by involved in your economic life. Okay, so that's one theoretical definition. We're not going into each thing that they stand for because it changes. Another theoretical definition would be that conservatives believe that most people will act out of their own self-interest. They will do what's best for themselves or their family, to see financially. That's what they'll do. Whereas liberals tend to believe that most people, and when I say most people, I'm talking about most people most of the time. I'm not talking about most people all the time or all the people most of the time. They're just saying a majority of the people, a majority of the time in both of these cases. Liberals believe that a majority of the people, a majority of the time, act out of what we call an enlightened self-interest. That they'll do, as Spike Lee once said, the right thing. That's what they'll do. Whether it benefits them financially or not. Now, the reason we call it enlightened self-interest, because even though you may not benefit financially in any particular way from it, doing right does make you feel good. And there's an endorphin release to it. And making yourself feel good by doing right is a type of self-interest, right? It's an enlightened self-interest. So they believe that most people will, most of the time, will ignore what's going to benefit them financially and do the right thing. And so that's really an area where you have to come down on and take a look at it in your own political philosophy. So say for example, that you went to Kroger, right? And you bought 6 filet mignons and everything else that you wanted to have for a cookout. And you got home and you noticed that Kroger charged you for $12. They overcharged you $30. What do? Well, most people in my classes, I'll go back and get my money. All right, fair enough. But if I reverse that around and I say, okay, you went to Albertsons and you bought the same things and you got home and you found out Albertsons didn't charge you for any of the fillets, what would you do? And people will rationalize why they won't go back and pay for those steaks. So they'll say things like, well, you know, they probably overcharged me in the past or whatever. And so that really is sort of a way politically on how you look at the nature of human beings, on how they would react to something like that. Now, of course, that can change too. Imagine that you're walking along and you find a wallet, and the wallet has $400 in cash in it, but it also has the name of an elderly person. It's got their address and their phone number. What do you do? Now, often most of my students will say, well, I'd go give it all back. And then I ask them, why is it you're not willing to give the money back to Albertsons, but you're willing to give the money back to this person? They go, because there's a face to it. And I always point out, I say, yes, I remember that the Bible says, thou shalt not steal unless it's from a corporation. And that plays into these general thoughts of what the basics of human nature are in a lot of different policies. For example, welfare, right? When you look at welfare, you'll have conservatives say, well, no, if you give money to people for doing nothing. They're just going to live off Uncle Sucker as long as they can, right? And they're going to take advantage of the system. Whereas liberals would say, well, no, 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 no. You know, if we give them money, they're going to use it for a helping hand to get themselves back on their feet and working. Now, this is one of those things that where we go back to epistemology on how we know what we know. And so when we look at welfare, it becomes much more complicated than either of these sides point out, right? So when you look at welfare recipients, demographically, most are white because the majority of the population is white in the United States. It's overwhelmingly women, single women, and they on average have 2 children outside of the apocryphal 10 children and whatever. Usually 2 children, usually maybe a high school degree in single, as I said. So when people say things like, well, why don't they just go get a job? There's a lot of minimum wage jobs out there. You have to stop and think about it for a moment and go, okay, you're a single mom, you got 2 young children, who knows where dad is, the deadbeat dad's gone, and you take a minimum wage job, you're gonna make $280 a week minus taxes. How much does it cost to maintain 2 children in daycare? What your rent costs are? All of these come into play. And so that the answer becomes much more complicated on how do you solve that problem, right? You know, the Texas Attorney General chases after deadbeat dads. Can we make it where people can go to work and then also make money and have some sort of daycare, right? So these all become much more complicated than politicians make it sound, right? That Richard Nixon said there's an easy answer to every problem, and it's usually the wrong answer because there's a lot of nuance in it. Now, the last group we're going to talk about here are the socialists. And we hear this all the time, right? We've got socialists and blah, blah, blah. They're going to be socialists. I'm going to give you an easy definition of socialism. It's a simple one, and of course things can be more complicated. And socialism usually refers to some sort of government intervention in the economy. Now, there are 2 types of socialists in the world. There are the democratic socialists, which you find in Canada, most of Europe, Japan, Mexico, Australia, Brazil, in most places. And democratic socialists tend to believe that the government should own the industries vital to the nation. That could be the airlines, British Airways, Lufthansa, Air France, Korean Air, something like that. It could be the healthcare system, right? That's also a possibility. It could be sometimes communication, energy production, those things. But most everything else left into the private industry. But also with a safety net for those who might fall through the cracks. And then on the other hand, you've got the Marxists. Now, the Marxists, one thing that Marxists really hate are socialists. They hate democratic socialists because they feel that they're impeding the eventual revolution. Now, the Marxists believe that the government should control all the means of production, this government of the proletariat, and that the government should tell factories what to produce, how much to produce. That is known as a command economy. Whereas in the United States, we operate what we call a market economy based on supply and demand. As we've seen before, these command economies haven't worked very well at all. I mean, the Soviet Union, it used to be, and this is a strange thing, is that if you wanted a car, you could go get a car, but there'd be a 5-year wait. And the old joke was that there was an American in Moscow, and he told the Russian, he said, look, we've got more cars than you do. And the Russian said, yes, but we've got more parking spaces. And this also led to a shortage of housing. Often in Russia, you might be living in a 700 square foot apartment, you, your wife, your children, your in-laws, her in-laws, and maybe your brother and his wife. And so what you really found in the Soviet Union, really in the 1970s, was an industrialized nation that had a rising rate of alcoholism, strangely enough, and lower mortality rate. People weren't living as long. But I should point out this too, because I get in this debate often, sometimes with my mom, is that most countries, successful countries, are blends of capitalism and socialism. The United States has socialism. The military is the biggest socialist industry you have. Socialized housing, socialized Medicare, medicine rather. And in the United States, if you're offering, if the government's offering low cost subsidies for crop insurance, that's socialism. If you're doing tariffs, that's socialism. If you're doing Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, the public school system, those are all elements of socialism. Now, in the United States, we tend to lean more to the capitalist side than most of the other places, because in the United States, we're into this idea of individualism. That's the individual's the most important thing. Whereas in the European countries, they tend to lean more toward the social side, the democratic social side, and think more in terms of the collective. And so both sides like where they're at, or have liked where they're at, but that's always going to be subject to change on both sides. It's just a matter of voter preference. So that's the different types of governmental systems, what government should do. In a nutshell, we could go on all day, and usually when it comes to liberal and conservative, I go into a lot more detail. And the next time, next Wednesday, when I do this actually live, we will talk about how do we spread power out in governmental systems. And that is talking about a unitary confederation and federal system. But hopefully in between there, I will tape something with a sociologist, and we'll talk a little bit about some of these topics that we just left off with. So thank you everybody for joining, and we'll talk again soon.